Have you ever entered a room and sensed within seconds that something was wrong, even when everyone was smiling? Have you ever noticed a lie before the first sentence was finished? Have you ever seen the hidden conflict behind a polite conversation, as if the truth were screaming in silence? Carl Jung would say that if this happens to you, the problem isn't excessive sensitivity. The problem is too much awareness. Jung's most dangerous discovery was not about madness, delirium, or mental illness. It was about people who, they see what others cannot, or cannot bear to see. People whose psychological perception is so refined that it pierces through social masks, rehearsed speeches, and repressed emotions as if they were glass. Jung observed this in his clinical practice with a mixture of fascination and concern, not because these people were fragile, but because seeing too much comes at a price that no one teaches you how to pay. Jung realized early on that there is a rare type of human being whose perception is not limited to visible behavior. These people pick up on involuntary micro-expressions, subtle changes in tone of voice, emotional inconsistencies, silent tensions. They don't interpret the other person. They feel the entire psychological field. And that's exactly where the conflict begins. Because the world wasn't built for those who see everything. The world is sustained by invisible agreements, by small collective denials, by softened truths, to maintain a possible coexistence. The question that troubled Jung was not why do these people suffer, but something far more unsettling. Why does clarity isolate? Why do those who see deeply end up tired, lonely, and emotionally drained? In his clinical records, Jung noticed a disturbing pattern. These individuals didn't fit the traditional frameworks of neurosis or psychosis. They thought clearly, they observed accurately, they had a rich inner life, and yet, they ended up exhausted, displaced, often treated as a problem. Here arises the first psychological micro-conflict. If seeing the truth should liberate, why does it often imprison? If perceiving hidden patterns should bring advantage, why do so many pay with isolation? Jung began to suspect that suffering did not come from perception itself, but from a discrepancy between individual consciousness and the level of collective consciousness. When someone sees what the group needs to deny in order to function, that person unknowingly becomes a silent threat to the surrounding psychological order. Jung wrote that consciousness is like a blade. When not sharp enough, it coexists well with the world. When excessively sharp, it cuts ties. He observed that these people did not intentionally provoke conflicts. Many tried to adapt, to remain silent, to pretend not to notice, but the body reacted. Fatigue arose. Unexplained irritation appeared. The feeling of carrying something that wasn't theirs began to weigh them down. Jung realized that these people absorbed emotional tensions from the environment like a psychic sponge, even when they didn't want to. Here another unsettling question arises. Is it possible to see everything and still belong? Jung began to suspect that, without specific psychological development, this ability becomes a burden. Clarity, when not integrated, ceases to be a gift and becomes an overload. The individual begins to perceive pains that are not their own, conflicts they did not create, shadows they did not choose to carry. And the more they try to explain what they see, the more misunderstood they feel. Jung did not romanticize this condition. On the contrary, he called it dangerous. Dangerous because without internal structure, differentiated perception erodes the sense of identity. The person begins to wonder, is what I feel mine or does it belong to the other? Does this weight belong to me or has it been absorbed? Am I intuitive or am I just tired of seeing too much? These doubts silently corrode the psychological center of the individual. The most disturbing aspect for Jung was realizing that these people don't go mad because they lose touch with reality, but because they have too much contact with her, with psychic reality, not with social appearance. They see the pain before it is admitted, the conflict before it explodes, the lie before it is verbalized, and ironically, they are punished for it. Jung began to understand that there is an invisible limit to the perception that the collective tolerates. Surpassing it doesn't generate admiration, it generates rejection. The individual begins to feel that they live in a parallel world, as if they were always one step ahead, but never accompanied. This loneliness is not merely emotional, it is existential. It is the feeling of inhabiting a level of consciousness that finds no mirror around it. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all arises here. What if the problem isn't with you, but with the fact that not all truths can be shared without consequences? Jung realized that this discovery demanded a response. If nothing was done, these people would be crushed by their own clarity. But if there was a way, he would need to teach something radical. Not how to see less, but how to see without being destroyed by what one sees. It was precisely this unease that led Jung to investigate more deeply the workings of this extreme perception. He didn't yet have all the answers, but he already knew something essential. When the unconscious becomes too conscious, without preparation, the price is high. And the case he would find next, real, documented, disturbing, would show just how far this perception could go and why it frightened Jung himself. In 1913, while Europe was unconsciously heading towards war, and Carl Jung was going through his own internal rupture after distancing himself from Freud, something silent was happening within his consulting room. It was during this period of psychic instability, which Jung himself would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, that a patient entered his life and forever changed his understanding of human consciousness. She didn't arrive talking about delusions, voices, or strange symptoms. On the contrary, she was lucid, articulate, and calm. Her complaint seemed simple: constant exhaustion, difficulty maintaining relationships, and a persistent feeling of not belonging anywhere. Jung quickly realized that this was no ordinary suffering. Something within her was operating on another level. The patient described everyday situations with a disturbing degree of precision. She said she would enter a room and immediately sense who was lying, who was emotionally broken, who was hiding anger behind cordiality. Not because people confessed anything, but because, according to her, the atmosphere spoke. Jung, a skeptic by nature, began to verify her observations. He questioned others, investigated stories, cross-referenced information, and repeatedly, he found that she was right. She described colleagues who seemed confident but collapsed a few weeks later. She spoke of couples who appeared harmonious and then, months later, separated explosively. She reported invisible family tensions that later emerged as serious conflicts. Jung noted something crucial. She did not predict events through rational deduction, but through direct perception of ongoing unconscious processes. The problem was that this skill offered no practical advantage. On the contrary, at work, her presence created discomfort. People felt watched, even when she remained silent. In meetings, it only took her noticing an inconsistency for the atmosphere to change. Colleagues began to avoid her, without knowing why. Something similar happened in friendships. People felt they couldn't pretend around her, and few could bear to be seen beyond the mask. This pattern isn't far removed from the daily lives of many viewers. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. You enter a room and sense a tension that no one mentions. You comment on something simple like, "I think this situation isn't resolved properly," and suddenly you're treated as negative, overly sensitive, or problematic. You didn't create the problem. You just noticed it beforehand. Yet, you're the one paying the social price. Jung realized that his patient was not suffering from talking too much, but from to perceive too much in a world that prefers not to perceive. She tried to adapt. She tried to pretend she didn't see. She tried to behave like everyone else. But her body reacted. Migraines appeared. A profound tiredness set in at the end of the day, even without physical exertion. Jung understood that she was absorbing psychic content from the environment without any conscious filter. Here a crucial point arises. Jung noted that she couldn't clearly distinguish between her own feelings and those coming from others. If someone close to her was distressed, she felt distress. If someone repressed anger, she carried an inexplicable weight. It was as if her psyche functioned without defined boundaries. Jung wrote that the problem wasn't an excess of empathy, but lack of psychic differentiation. He began to suspect that this type of awareness arose when the unconscious became accessible before the ego was prepared to deal with it. In other words, perception advanced faster than the internal structure capable of sustaining it. This explained why she seemed mature in observation, but fragile in emotional support. The most unsettling aspect came when Jung realized that this patient was not an isolated case. Others would later exhibit similar patterns. People who know too much, feel too much, perceive too much, and therefore live tired, displaced, often labeled as intense or difficult. Jung understood that he was not facing a clinical anomaly, but a specific psychological type rare and poorly understood. And then came the question that changed the course of his investigation. What happens when the collective unconscious begins to invade individual consciousness without permission? Jung realized he needed to understand the mechanism behind this. or these people would continue to be treated as a problem when in fact they were a symptom of something much bigger. He didn't yet have an exact name for the phenomenon, but he already sensed that an unconscious participation was taking place, a silent fusion between the individual and the surrounding psychic field, something ancient, primitive, powerful, something that, if not understood, could not only make individuals ill, but destabilize entire groups. It was this restlessness that led Jung to rescue a forgotten concept from anthropology and depth psychology, a concept that would explain why these people not only perceive the environment, but they are affected by it as if there were no separation. And when Jung named this phenomenon, everything began to make sense, including why these people feel, from an early age, as if they are carrying the world on their shoulders without knowing why. When Jung finally named the phenomenon he was observing, everything gained a disturbing coherence. He called it participation mystique, a state in which the boundaries between the self and the other are not clearly formed, and the psyche functions as an open field. For these people, the inner world does not end at their own skin. Emotions, tensions, and conflicts of others cross over without asking permission. It is not imagination. It is not supposition. It is direct experience. Jung realized that, in these individuals, consciousness does not observe the environment. It participates. This participation doesn't happen in a mystical, romantic sense. It's psychological, concrete, and daily. The body reacts before thought. A tightness in the chest arises upon entering a seemingly tranquil room. Sudden fatigue appears after talking to someone who seems fine. Irritation without a clear cause sets in after a short meeting. Jung understood that these reactions didn't come from within, but from without, absorbed, not created. Here emerges an important pattern break. What if what you call your tiredness isn't yours? What if part of your anxiety didn't originate within you, but entered through an overly open perception? Jung began to raise this hypothesis when he noticed that his patients improved not by understanding themselves better, but by learning to differentiate what belonged to them from what came from the environment. The common mistake is to call this empathy. Jung disagreed. Empathy presupposes choice and distance. What he observed was unconscious intrusion. The psyche of the highly perceptive individual functions like a membrane that is too thin. It registers the collective emotional climate with precision, but initially lacks the necessary filters to protect itself. Therefore, these people often feel guilt, confusion, and exhaustion for no apparent reason. Jung wrote that, in these cases, the collective unconscious finds an open door, and when it enters, it doesn't ask permission. It occupies psychic space, consumes vital energy, and scrambles identity. The individual begins to experience emotional states that don't correspond to their own history. They start reacting as if other people's problems were their own. And the more they try to solve these states, the more lost they become. Now, a direct question. How many times have you tried to understand yourself, reflected, analyzed, and still felt that something didn't add up? How many times have you sought answers within yourself when what was affecting you came from outside? Jung realized that this constant movement of introspection can, paradoxically, worsen the situation when the real cause is unconscious absorption. The most delicate aspect of this discovery was realizing that society does not recognize this phenomenon. On the contrary, people with participation mystique, they are encouraged to endure, be strong, not absorb, as if it were a conscious decision. Jung saw this as a serious mistake. Without understanding, the individual internalizes guilt. They begin to see themselves as weak, unstable, or problematic, when in fact they are functioning with an advanced, but unintegrated, perceptual system. Jung also noted something disturbing. The more sensitive the individual, the sooner they come into contact with the dark contents of the collective, repressed fears, unacknowledged aggression, silent resentments. This explains why many feel heavy from a young age, even having an apparently ordinary life. They are in contact with something that the group has not yet processed. Here's another narrative shift. What if your discomfort isn't a sign of inadequacy, but an early warning? Jung began to see these individuals as psychic sensors of the environment. They pick up on flaws before they become visible. The problem is that the sensor feels it first and pays the price alone. But this boundless perception comes at a high price. Jung observed that, without differentiation, the self begins to dissolve. The person no longer knows what they want, what they feel, what they think on their own. They live reacting to the environment. They become functional, but empty, present, but absent from themselves. This is the point at which perception ceases to be a gift and becomes a real risk. How many times have you felt like you've lost touch with your own will, that your decisions always seem to respond to what others need or feel? Jung would say that this isn't altruism, it's a loss of psychic boundaries. It was at that moment that Jung understood the gravity of what he was dealing with. Participation mystique, non-integrated understanding, not only tires you out, it can destroy individuality. The individual becomes a conduit for collective content. They live occupied by emotions they didn't choose, and slowly, they begin to disappear behind the perceptive function. But Jung didn't stop at the diagnosis. He realized that this state wasn't an error of the psyche, but a primitive stage that needed to be consciously overcome. The problem wasn't participating in the collective field, but not knowing how to get out of it. Perception needed to be accompanied by structure. Without it, consciousness drowns in what it perceives. And here arises the inevitable suspense. If this state is so dangerous, why does it exist? Why are some people born with this extreme psychic openness? Jung began to suspect that this condition was not an individual accident, but a specific psychological function with different forms of manifestation. And when he began to observe these variations, something even more unsettling appeared. Not everyone suffers in the same way. Not everyone perceives it in the same way. And some patterns are much more vulnerable to destruction than others. Jung realized that when perception exceeds the limits tolerated by the group, something predictable happens. It doesn't matter the context, culture, or level of education. The individual who sees what others repress ends up being treated as the source of the problem. Jung called this shadow projection, an unconscious mechanism as old as the human psyche itself. For Jung, the shadow is not evil itself, but everything that the ego cannot accept about itself: fears, aggressive impulses, envy, fragility, contradictions. When these parts remain unconscious, they do not disappear. They seek an external target, and that is precisely where the person with heightened perception comes into play. Jung observed this repeatedly in his clinic. Patients reported the same pattern. When calmly pointing out a problem, they were accused of creating conflict. When they showed genuine concern, they were called pessimists. When they remained silent, they were seen as judgmental. There was no way out. Their mere presence seemed to provoke intense defensive reactions. This doesn't happen because these people are hostile. It happens because they function as involuntary mirrors. Jung wrote that nothing is more disturbing to the unconscious than seeing reflected what has been carefully denied. When someone perceives the lie before it is told, the tension before it is admitted, the resentment before it explodes, the other person feels invaded, even if nothing has been verbalized. Here's a piece of data that confirms Jung's observation from another perspective. Modern studies in social psychology show that groups tend to reject individuals who raise collective awareness. Research on group dynamics indicates that members who point out inconsistencies or real problems are up to 3 times more likely to be marginalized than those who conform, even when they are right. The group prefers to preserve emotional stability over uncomfortable truth. Jung realized that this was not a moral failing in people, but an automatic psychic defense. Integrating the shadow requires energy, responsibility, and maturity. Attacking the mirror requires only impulse. Therefore, the most common path is disguised hostility, small comments, ironies, subtle exclusions. The highly perceptive person begins to feel that something is wrong but cannot pinpoint a clear reason. Perhaps you recognize this pattern. You enter a new environment, and after some time you realize you're being treated as difficult, not because you did anything wrong, but because you don't fit into the unspoken agreement of pretending everything is all right. Jung would say that at that moment, you were unconsciously chosen as the receptacle of the collective shadow. He called it scapegoat phenomenon. In families, it's the overly sensitive member. In companies, it's the problem employee. In social groups, it's the intense one. The projected content varies, but the function is the same. Someone needs to carry what the group doesn't want to acknowledge in itself. Jung observed that the more unconscious the group, the more violent the projection. A historical fact illustrates this clearly. Jung analyzed traditional communities where individuals who perceived tensions before others were labeled as cursed or dangerous. In some cultures, these people were expelled. In others, symbolically sacrificed. The unconscious logic was simple. Eliminating the mirror eliminates the discomfort. The problem, of course, never disappeared. It only returned in another form. In modern daily life, the mechanism is more subtle, but no less effective. Exclusion doesn't happen with torches, but with silence. Hostility doesn't come with shouts, but with emotional detachment. Jung warned that this type of silent rejection is even more psychologically devastating because the individual begins to doubt themselves. Am I the problem? Here a crucial point arises. Jung realized that many highly perceptive people internalize projection. They begin to carry guilt that doesn't belong to them. They try to correct themselves, diminish themselves, adjust themselves. The result is chronic exhaustion and a gradual loss of confidence in one's own perception. The person begins to disconnect from their most valuable function in an attempt to survive socially. Contemporary studies on emotional burnout show that individuals who act as informal emotional regulators in groups have significantly higher levels of psychological exhaustion. They absorb tension, conflict, and unprocessed emotions, exactly what Jung described decades earlier. The difference is that Jung had already realized that this is not a conscious choice, but a consequence of overly open perception. Jung was surprised to find that shadow projection is not intentional. Even well-intentioned people attack the mirror. They feel discomfort without knowing why, and seek relief by distancing themselves from the source. Therefore, rational explanations rarely work. The conflict is not conscious, it is archetypal. The question Jung began to ask himself was even more disturbing. If this mechanism is inevitable, how can someone with heightened perception survive psychologically without becoming bitter, isolated, or fragmented? Ignoring the phenomenon didn't work. Confronting it directly didn't work either. It was necessary to understand something deeper. It was then that Jung realized that the danger lay not only in the external projection, but in the individual's internal reaction to it. Some shrank back, others inflated their ego, others withdrew completely from the world. None of these responses solved the problem. On the contrary, they all led to new forms of suffering. Jung began to suspect that differential perception was not a single condition, but manifested itself in distinct ways, and that each form had specific vulnerabilities in the face of shadow projection. Some were emotionally drained, others became excessively analytical, others lost touch with their bodies, and some simply collapsed under the weight of what they perceived. This realization led Jung to take the next step in his investigation. If there were different ways of perceiving the collective unconscious, then there were also different risks and needs for integration. And understanding these variations would become essential to prevent perception, instead of evolving consciousness, from destroying those who possess it. After years of observing patients with heightened awareness, Jung realized that suffering did not arise in a single way. Although the mechanism was the same, direct contact with unconscious content, the way it manifested varied profoundly. It wasn't just a matter of sensitivity, it was a specific psychic configuration. Ignoring these differences led to incorrect diagnoses and failed strategies. Jung began to notice recurring patterns. Some patients became emotionally ill, others mentally, others physically. Some were lost in silent exhaustion, while others became inflated with certainty and ended up isolated by unconscious arrogance. This diversity led Jung to a crucial conclusion. There is no single type of intuitive perception, but internal variations, each with its own risks. There were those whom Jung described as intuitives with a heightened feeling function. These people not only perceived the unconscious of others, they felt it in their own bodies. Other people's emotions arose as if they were their own. Sadness without cause, sudden anxiety, inexplicable guilt. Many believed themselves to be emotionally unstable when in reality they were experiencing states that did not belong to them. Jung observed that these individuals were the most vulnerable to burnout because they confused absorption with identity. Others presented a different combination, intuition linked to thought. These individuals didn't feel things so much in their bodies, but they saw patterns with almost disconcerting clarity. They anticipated failures in projects, ruptures in relationships, emotional collapses in people close to them, not through logical analysis, but through an unconscious reading of ongoing processes. The problem is that this ability often placed them in the position of messengers of what nobody wants to hear. Jung noted that many were treated as cold or pessimistic, when in fact they were simply seeing things beforehand. There were also those whose intuition expressed itself through the body. Jung observed patients who perceived physical symptoms before any examination revealed anything. They detected extreme fatigue in someone who said they were fine, felt muscle tension associated with repressed emotional conflicts, and perceived illnesses in their early stages. These individuals, without understanding what was happening to them, often developed psychosomatic symptoms because they carried signals that were not their own. And then there was the rarest and most fragile type of all, the almost pure intuitive. These people captured an enormous amount of unconscious information, but lacked a sufficiently developed auxiliary function to organize what they perceived. They lived in a state of constant overload, fragmented thoughts, difficulty expressing themselves, a feeling of internal chaos. Jung observed that without adequate support, this pattern quickly led to dissociation or psychological collapse. In identifying these variations, Jung also recognized three central dangers that permeated all types when perception was not integrated. The first was the disruption of the collective unconscious. Every society functions with silent agreements about what can or cannot be seen. When someone perceives beyond these limits, they destabilize the system. Even unintentionally, their mere presence threatens the psychological order of the group. The second danger was existential isolation. Jung described this as the loneliness of advanced consciousness. It's not just social loneliness, but the feeling of living in a different reality. The individual feels they perceive layers of the world that cannot be shared, and this distance, when not understood, transforms into silent despair. The third danger was the most serious, the dissolution of identity. When someone lives absorbing other people's content without differentiation, they lose contact with their own psychic center. Desires become confused, emotions become mixed, decisions cease to be authentic. Jung called this the loss of self in favor of unconscious participation. At this point, perception ceases to expand consciousness and begins to destroy it. Perhaps you recognize something of this in yourself. Perhaps you've wondered why you feel drained after certain encounters, why specific environments seem heavy for no apparent reason, or why your clarity often generates rejection instead of recognition. Jung would say that this is neither bad luck nor a character flaw. It's the side effect of a powerful psychic function operating without integration. The most common mistake, according to Jung, is trying to fix this by diminishing perception, silencing intuition, pretending not to see, adapting to the collective level. But he observed that this exacts an even higher price. The repressed perception doesn't disappear. It turns against the individual. It emerges as anxiety, depression, physical symptoms, or existential emptiness. On the other hand, Jung also warned against the opposite risk, identifying too much with this capacity. The person begins to define themselves exclusively by what they see. They develop an unconscious sense of superiority. They believe that others are blind or backward. This state, which Jung called psychic inflation, leads to total isolation and loss of humanity. Between repression and inflation, Jung realized that there was a third way, a difficult, demanding, but transformative way, a process that did not eliminate perception, but made it habitable, a method that allowed one to see deeply without getting lost. It was from this urgent need to save individuals from being destroyed by their own conscience that Jung developed what he considered his most important contribution, a process capable of transforming dangerous perception into evolutionary function, a path that promised not comfort, but integrity. And it is precisely this path that he called individuation. Jung knew that getting to this point wasn't comfortable. He never promised comfort. What he offered was something even rarer, integration. After observing individuals destroyed by their own clarity, and others transformed by it, Jung understood that superior perception is not a flaw in the psyche. It is an advanced function which demands conscious responsibility. Without it, a person is lost. With it, they become whole. The central point that Jung made clear is simple and difficult at the same time. You don't need to see less in order to suffer less. You need to relate better to what you see. Suffering does not stem from perception, but from the absence of an internal structure to support it. When consciousness grows faster than the ego, chaos arises. When the ego matures alongside it, wisdom emerges. Jung called this maturation individuation, not as an abstract concept but as a practical path, a living process. And it begins with something essential, conscious differentiation. The first concrete action is learning to separate what is yours from what is not. This requires real pauses, daily silence, moments without external stimuli. Jung advised his patients to be alone, not to isolate themselves from the world, but to allow what has been absorbed to dissolve. If you never slow down, you never discover what you truly feel. The second step is the most uncomfortable, To integrate one's own shadow, Jung was direct in stating that what disturbs us most in others points to something not integrated within ourselves. Highly perceptive people suffer more because they see shadows everywhere, but they suffer even more when they deny their own. The practice here is honest and continuous, recognizing in yourself the same contradictions, impulses, and fragilities that you see outside. This does not diminish your clarity. On the contrary, it removes the emotional weight it carries. The third step is to develop conscious psychic boundaries. Jung taught that not all truth needs to be spoken, nor does all perception need to be shared. Knowing when to speak, with whom to speak, and how to speak is part of the maturity of consciousness. The practical application is simple but requires discipline. Observe before intervening. Test the other person's openness with small observations. If there is curiosity, advance. If there is defensiveness, retreat, not out of fear, but as a psychic strategy. The fourth step is to choose environments that don't drain your identity. Jung was clear. Not every group is compatible with differentiated consciousness. Remaining in chronically unconscious environments takes a heavy toll. The concrete action here is to assess where you are spending your energy. Relationships, work, social circles. Where do you leave more tired than when you arrived? Where do you need to diminish yourself to fit in? These places are not fields of growth. They are fields of exhaustion. The fifth step is to transform perception into conscious service, not in sacrifice. Jung observed that integrated individuals use their clarity to help without losing themselves. They don't save everyone. They don't correct everyone. They don't carry the world on their shoulders. They offer presence, not redemption. The practice here is to ask before acting, is this mine to carry? If not, let go. Consciousness doesn't demand martyrdom. Finally, Jung insisted on something many ignore. No one individuates alone. The practical application includes seeking at least one relationship where you don't need to defend yourself from your own depth. A person, a space, a dialogue where your perception isn't seen as a threat. These connections are rare, but essential. It is in them that consciousness finds a mirror and rest. The story of the 1913 patient ends here for an important reason. After years of working with Jung, she had not lost her insight. She gained direction. She learned to recognize what she absorbed, integrated her shadow, chose compatible environments, and found a role where her clarity was useful, not destructive. Jung wrote that she didn't come to see less. She came to see with wisdom. And that's the final twist of this video. If you recognize yourself as someone who feels too much, perceives too much, understands too much prematurely, that's not a flaw. It's a calling, but a calling that demands maturity. A consciousness that isn't structured becomes a burden. A consciousness that is integrated becomes silent force. Jung believed that such people are pioneers of the psyche. They perceive things earlier because the collective consciousness is not yet ready. But this does not condemn them to suffering. It only requires them to walk with more inner responsibility. Now, the action is up to you. Reflect on where you are absorbing what is not yours. Observe where you are remaining silent out of fear or exposing yourself without strategy. Choose a simple practice from this part and apply it today. Small, sustained changes profoundly transform your relationship with your perception. If this content resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. Like the video so it reaches other people who also feel overwhelmed by seeing too much. And if you'd like, share your experience or questions in the comments. You can do this anonymously. Here, your clarity of vision is not a problem. It's welcome.